Okay, I believe we're live. Hello, good morning from here in Minnesota, or maybe good afternoon or good evening to you, wherever you are in the world. And welcome to another Spider Strategies monthly training webinar. It's January of 2019, and this month we'll be covering an introduction to scoring and colors in QuickScore. My name is Tom Keating, and I'm the Training and Customer Experience Consultant at Spider Strategies. I'm pleased and honored to be with you today as your presenter. I always do like to just inform people of my contact information of tom.keating@spiderstrategies.com, and certainly welcome you to reach out to me with any potentially follow-up questions to today's experience or other broad questions you may have regarding our Spider Strategies solutions. Before we get into the actual webinar, I just want to touch briefly on some logistic points. First of all, this webinar is being recorded for your future use and reference. All you attendees, all you live attendees are currently muted. When I do this every month, I always apologize for having to mute you during the actual, webinar, because I always express I would love for this to be more of a dialogue than a monologue. But again, our experience has taught us that if we leave the phone lines open, pretty much inevitably there'll be some kind of background noise or noise pollution that kind of just hinder the overall experience. But today, at the end of the session, we're going to try to do what we promised we would try to do in 2019, is to leave a little bit of time at the end of the session to open up the phone lines, to open or unmute them for a general Q&A after my presentation. So this will be our first run at it. Be patient with us when we get to that point, but we're looking forward to hopefully even just hearing back from you live today. Okay, today's agenda. What are we going to cover today? We're going to start with a review of colors and scores in the QuickScore solution and in the various applications throughout QuickScore. Then we'll move into an introduction to the concept of normalized scoring and associated colors in QuickScore. And we'll introduce you to a variety of different scoring types available to you in QuickScore. We'll then take a few minutes to get into a deeper dive review of some of the most commonly used scoring types. And then lastly, we'll discuss score roll-ups, the impact of weighting, and we'll address some administrative settings around scoring that we believe you should be aware of. So first of all, let's just start again with a brief demonstration of QuickScore. And what we're going to be focusing on here is just an overall review, looking for colors and scores within QuickScore applications, where they are and how you can use them. So what I'll do is, of course, bring QuickScore up. I've logged in just as a view user or contributor who is responsible as an owner and an updater for certain measures, but generally speaking is not an application developer. I've landed at the home page, and immediately right on the home page, smack in the middle under the new alerts section, you immediately see the impact of colors and scores being reflected right on our home page under new alerts. So as a consumer here, what I could do is dive into the customer satisfaction survey and investigate the performance that I saw colored as green with a score of 7.3. That alert was set up was presented to me because I subscribed to alert where I wanted to know if this particular measure, if its score was larger or higher than 5. And sure enough, I see immediately that we're in the green. And that, of course, just intuitively tells me that green means good performance. If you just inherently understand the paradigm of red, yellow, and green traffic light scoring, where red is poor performance, yellow is medium performance, and green is exceptional or good performance, you will immediately understand where scoring and coloring adds value in the QuickScore application. So looking at the customer satisfaction survey, again, the speedometer gauge is, of course, colored green. I see my score of 7.3. And over on the right, I see a nice line chart giving me a historical perspective of how I've done over time. And again, the color coding intuitively tells me exactly how we have performed month over the past year. Also, if I go to the Measures tab, I can get into a bit more detail about this particular customer satisfaction survey, and again, employ the color coding to get an easy-to-see understanding of where we were middle performing, where we were underperforming, and where we were overperforming. while I'm in here reviewing the customer satisfaction survey, my attention on the left is also brought to customer churn. And the reason it's attracting my attention is that there's a little red dot to the right of customer churn, giving me a sense that customer churn is red and is thus underperforming for the month of December 2018. So I can change my investigation over to customer churn. If I jump back to the overview tab, sure enough, the speedometer gauge indicates to me, I should say, that we are performing poorly. The line graph on the right and the colors presented to me there, again, similarly give me a historical perspective of performance. And I see that over the last 6 months or so, we've really been struggling in the customer churn area of our customer help desk scorecard. After reviewing that detailed information about both customer satisfaction and customer churn, I can return to the home page. Within the home page, if I go over to the Your Responsibilities area and take a look at measures that I own, once again, I have nice color-coded information provided to me about the various measures that I've been assigned to as an owner. Again, the red, yellow, and green coloring gives me immediate intuitive understanding of overall performance of a given measure. Over to the right, I'm presented with the score detail information as well as the actual performance information for the most recently completed time period that we've logged data within QuickScore. Along the top, again, color-coded filters, where if I'd like to reduce this table or presentation down to just my over-performing measures in green, or my middle or average performing measures in yellow, or my 2 underperforming measures, I can easily filter the table or the list of the measures down. And sure enough, as we just saw, there's that customer churn measure that we just investigated. And again, in terms of measures that I own, I can easily just click on customer churn and get back to that detailed level scorecard overview presentation of what's going on with customer churn. I'll return to the home page. With regard to measures I update and where colors come into play as I'm updating measures, I can take a look at this list of the 5 measures that I'm responsible for updating, and I see that in the month of December 2018, I still have 1 to go. But for the measures that I've already updated, they get immediately color-coded to be, again, middle performing for product revenue, underperforming training revenue, and underperforming book revenue. Similarly, on the right, I'm able to view the thresholds that have been set up for those measures, and again, a sense of where is red, where is yellow, and where is green. So color coding throughout, I should say, QuickScore is there to help you just intuitively understand your performance without necessarily needing to get into all the detail information available to you. Other places where color coding, of course, comes into play is within strategy maps, dashboards, and charts and reports. To review some of those, I'll just open up an existing briefing that contains elements of strategy maps, scorecards, and reports. I'll open up the monthly staff meeting briefing and go ahead and make it full screen presentation. We start out here on page 1 of this briefing with a nice strategy map. And here, again, if nothing else, strategy maps and the color coding that is employed and applied to strategy maps really, I believe, show the value of color coding and scoring throughout QuickScore. As you guys are familiar with strategy maps in QuickScore, I'm able to navigate forward and backward in time to review different months and our performance across our different perspectives and the objectives within those perspectives. And thanks to the color coding, I'm quickly and easily able to find areas of either overperformance, underperformance, areas where I might want to investigate further, such as diving into reduced sales overhead costs in the upper left-hand corner. I can dive into that single particular objective and get a sense of how are we doing, why are we doing, what measures are feeding that, and so on. And again, the color coding and the scoring is prevalent at all of the different levels within all the various applications. I'll return back to page 1 of that briefing and the strategy map, and we'll move to page 2, where we have a nice, what I always call cockpit style dashboard composed of 6 different speedometer gauges. Again, the color coding, of course, gives you immediate insight and understanding of performance for each of these 6 different measures. And of course, in each case, we're also sharing actual normalized score for that measure, as well as the red values and the goal values that have been defined to set, if you will, thresholds, performance thresholds for each of those measures. Moving to yet another page of this briefing, this is a nice sort of creative, artistically creative presentation, again, of information. Again, I'll just navigate back through time to show you that as we move month to month, again, the colors applied to these different measures, of course, are going to reflect the actual performance for any given time period. And once again, you don't necessarily need to show all the detail information right here on this dashboard, because you can easily click through, for instance, through ad clicks, to get down to the detail information about ad clicks, and again, have that color-based presentation of all the information, all the detail information, whether it be visual or tabular in nature. All right, and I'll go back to the briefing. One last page we just want to review here within the briefing is a detail report. Detail reports are great if you want to get down to the minutia of detailed information about your business, but sometimes the opportunity to just get a nice color-based overview of how each and every one of those actual values falls in a normalized 0 to 10 scoring spectrum can be very helpful to give you a sense of trends and overall performance. Okay, so I'll stop that briefing. And at this point, that is really just the review that I intend to take of, colors and scoring that you will find and see within QuickScore. Okay, moving on with our agenda. A couple more agenda items that we'll cover together. First is an overall introduction to normalized scoring and associated colors in QuickScore, and a brief introduction to all of the scoring types that you'll find in QuickScore. Sorry. Okay, so scoring in QuickScore. Measures and their associated 0 to 10 normalized scores and colors are the foundation, as we saw, of how performance is tracked and visually presented in QuickScore. The QuickScore Performance Management Solution assigns a normalized score number between 0 and 10 and a color associated with that normalized score to actual performance values that you provide for any given measure. And that is done according to the scoring type and the scoring thresholds that are assigned to the measure. A very common question that we're asked by prospects and new customers is, why does QuickScore apply normalized scoring? Wow, what's happening here? Sorry guys, my PowerPoint is kind of freaking out here a little bit. Let me just catch back up. So why normalized scoring? Well, to be just very simple, and the answer is that to really evaluate overall business performance across myriad different enterprise KPIs, you need a common or shared scoring system to be able to equitably compare business apples to business oranges to business bananas, right? So in this case, imagine an enterprise where they're tracking, of course, sales revenue, they're tracking customer churn, performance, and they're tracking profit percentage, each of which, of course, are distinctly different types of measures using different units of measure. One, of course, is going to be dollar-based with sales revenue. Customer churn will be unit or number person-based. And profit percentage is, of course, percentage-based. So imagine that for a given single month, we have tracked our performance and come up with that we have an actual sales revenue performance of $550,000. In terms of customer churn, we lost 80 customers, and with profit percentage, we turned in an actual value of 33%. Again, completely different types of measures. So the question here is, how are we really performing as an overall multi-division enterprise? Well, if you're able to translate those actual values into normalized scores based on the appropriate scoring type that you set for each of those distinct measures, you can bring those normalized scores together and achieve an understanding on a 0 to 10 normalized scale of your overall enterprise performance of, in this case, 5.33. And the question here is, where do we come up with 5.33, or how or why is that the value? Well, simply, it's the average of the normalized scores. 6 plus 2 plus 8, 16. Divide the 16 by 3, and you get your 5.33. So that, in a nutshell, is the story behind why normalized scoring and why we bring it to play in QuickScore. Now, setting up the normalized 0 to 10 scoring paradigm in QuickScore is, again, fairly straightforward. You start, of course, by creating a measure. In this case, it could be, again, our sales revenue, the churn, the profit percentage, what have you. Now, knowing your business, you should be able to define actual performance values that are very bad, and at the far other end of the spectrum, very good, and then also some, in between there, of course, some medium performance values that you hope to just maintain or achieve on a regular basis. And what you do is, if you will, translate or introduce or teach the QuickScore system how to translate those values, those actual values, into normalized scores on a spectrum of 0 to 10. So your very bad, or we'll call it worst value, will be assigned or aligned with a normalized score of 0. Your very good, or if you will, best value, actual value, will be aligned with a normalized score of 10. And in between, middle performance will be somewhere in between 0 and 10. An example of that might be sales revenue, where for a given month, if we only make $100,000, that's just terrible performance, and it should be scored with a number of 0. On the other end, if we make $750,000 in a single month, that's exceptional. It's off the charts, and it should receive a normalized score of 10. And of course, something like 425 would fall in the middle and get a normalized score of 5. Another example would be customer churn. Again, the same idea of a 0 to 10 scoring spectrum, but in this case, it's sort of flipped around, where we don't want to lose customers. So losing 0 customers is exceptional, and it should be scored with a normalized score of 10. On the other end, losing 80 customers is terrible, and we would assign it a normalized score of 0. Once again, 40 kind of sits in the middle, and it would get a normalized score of 5. Another less common example, but certainly pertinent to some of our customers, is an example of something like warehouse inventory, where actually what you're trying to do is maintain a consistent number, an appropriate number of, let's say, widgets in your warehouse. And you identify that based on your performance over time, that 400 is the perfect number of widgets that you want to have constantly in your warehouse. And that you've learned that if you dip down to 200, that's awful. You'll never be able to fulfill enough orders, so that should be scored 0. Similarly, if you have too many widgets on hand, you don't have anywhere to store them. It creates logistical hassles and problems. So that should also similarly be scored with a normalized score of 0. Okay? So the point here in those examples is there are different approaches to setting up and utilizing the normalized scoring system of 0 to 10. Now, in terms of how you take that 0 to 10 spectrum, divide it up, color it, and present it to your QuickScore users, is you've got, again, a lot of different choices. And what we'll do here is just give you a brief introduction to some of those different, scoring types and coloring choices. The most commonly employed scoring type is goal and red flag, followed up quickly by the 3-color scoring. And obviously, in this case, all you're doing is taking your 0 to 10 spectrum of normalized scores, dividing it equally into thirds, and coloring them with the classic traffic lights coloring of red, yellow, and green. You also may want to just get a little simpler and just say, no, we don't need the yellow. We just want to color things as either red, effectively underperforming, or green, overperforming. In this case, of course, you're just setting it up with those 2 colors. You set up effectively a goal kind of threshold, and things will be scored and colored appropriately. Another approach with that sort of binary red or green only coloring is for goal only and yes or no scoring, where if a goal is achieved, it gets a full-on 10 for its normalized score. If it's not achieved, it just gets 0. Same idea with yes or no. If something is yes and that's a good answer, it gets 10. If it's no, that's a bad answer, it gets 0. Quite simple, very sort of black and white, no gray in the middle, no scores such as 5 or 6 or 3 being applied. Another option here is to take that 3-color scoring paradigm and just expand upon it. Instead of dividing your 0 to 10 normalized spectrum in thirds, you divide it into quarters and throw in another color here, in this case, orange. But again, the same idea of just breaking it down into, if you will, sections which get scored and colored. Again, back to that warehouse inventory example, this is how you can set up what we call stabilized scoring, where again, in the middle is your best value, your ideal number. And as you get away from that ideal number, the scores are reduced all the way down to 0 and 0 on each of the far worst ends, high and low. And lastly, then you can take that stabilized paradigm or approach and break it down yet even further if you want to get into, some yellow scoring and some more detailed underlying normalized score that you can present. Okay. Now, scoring types. I've given you just over the past couple of minutes a wide variety of sort of choices. QuickScore actually provides you with 11 different scoring types, giving you, of course, many options for associating your actual performance values with normalized scores and coloring those normalized scores. So I'm presenting you with all 11. I know that's an overwhelming list of scoring types. I'm not going to read the list at you, and nor today do we have time to cover all 11 of these different scoring types. What we will do is, again, just quickly returning to the agenda and just kind of level setting where we are in our agenda, is we'll take a bit of a deeper dive review of some of the most commonly used scoring types. All right. So today what we'll be doing is focusing our attention on, again, primarily the first and most commonly used scoring types of goal, red flag, and or 3-color. We'll devote most of our attention to that. I also then just want to help you understand how to set up goal only, yes and no, and 2-color. Those 3 different choices of kind of the binary red or green choices. We also just quickly want to address the 2-color stabilize. And lastly, a scoring type that I haven't yet mentioned, but is important to know about and comes into play in a variety of ways, is unscored. Okay? All right. So normalized scores and colors in QuickScore again. The most commonly used is this goal and red flag and 3-color scoring. And in setting this up, you quite simply identify or define a worst actual performance value, a red flag value, a goal value, and a best value. And each of those 4 distinctly defined values will be aligned or tied to a normalized score of 0, 3.33, 6.67, and 10. Now, if you're going to set up the goal and red flag scoring, what you do is, of course, start with a measure. In this case, we're using the units sold per month as our mythical measure, and you define a goal value. In this case, 800 units is what we aspire to sell per month. You also set up and define a red flag value, in this case, 500. When you define those numbers, the system automatically aligns the goal with a normalized score of 6.67 and the red flag with a normalized score of 3.33. And going forward, any values that fall between 500 and 800 will automatically be colored yellow and be assigned an appropriate normalized score, depending on what the value is. The software also acknowledges a 300 unit difference or delta between your worst or your red flag of 500 and your goal of 800. And it takes that 300 unit difference and it subtracts it from the red flag of 500 to define 200 as the worst value, which will be aligned or tied to a normalized score of 0. It similarly takes that 300 unit difference, extends it beyond the 800 goal to define an 1100 best threshold, again, which will be tied to the normalized score of 10. The key takeaway from this setup or this setting up this type of scoring is that QuickScore automatically defines your worst and best actual value thresholds for you based purely on the difference between the red flag and the goal actual values. Okay? The QuickScore system does it for you. The advantage to this is that you only have to provide 2 numbers. You have to provide a goal and you provide a red flag. Everything else is taken care of for you. But in certain situations, you may want some more control over defining your worst and your best values. So in that case, this is where the use of the 3-color scoring is more appropriate. In this paradigm, again, using the same mythical unit of units sold per month, we could set the same goal of 800, the same red flag of 500. Again, those values are going to be automatically tied to normalized scores of 3.33, 6.67. Yellow coloring will be presented for any values between them. And again, the software does acknowledge the 300 unit difference, but it doesn't use that to define the worst. The worst value is going to be defined by you, the user. So it's up to you what you want to define as your worst. In this case, we've set it up to be 0. So the actual value of 0 will be tied to the normalized score of 0. Similarly, you can define your own user-defined best value, which again will be tied to the normalized score of 10. And again, the key or primary takeaway from this setup is that you are defining the worst threshold and the best threshold, regardless of the difference between the red flag and the goal values. So now that we've covered the setup of those, the theoretical setup of those, let's just talk about how scoring actually occurs once that has been set up. So let's imagine that for a given month, we have an actual value of 1,000, and we input that information as the actual value for units sold per month into QuickScore. It's logged as 1,000. It will get scored as 8.89. Now the question here is why 8.89? Well, the actual value of 1,000 sits 2/3 of the way into the 300 unit actual value difference between goal and best. You take that 2/3, 2/3 of the 3.33 normalized score difference between goal and best is 2.22. And if you simply add the 2.22 on top of the 6.67 normalized score for the 800, you come up with your 8.89. If we take that same exact 1,000 actual value and put it into a 3-color scoring setup like we just discussed, we come up with a different normalized score of 7.62. And again, the question here is why? What's the math that's going on behind the scenes? Again, it's a similar paradigm where the actual value of 1,000 in this case lands 2/7 of the 700 unit actual value difference between goal and best. 2/7 of the 3.3 normalized score difference between goal and best is 0.95. And once again, all we're doing here is adding that 0.95 on top of the 6.67 normalized score for goal to come up with the 7.62 for normalized score for that 1,000 unit actual value. And I'm going to pause here and just say that this paradigm, this methodology, this is how scoring is applied really regardless of the scoring type that you're using. This idea of setting up the scoring type you want, the thresholds that are appropriate, and then presenting scores and allowing the software to use the defined thresholds to determine an actual or a normalized score and an appropriate color is what is applied across all of the 10 scoring types within QuickScore. Okay, so let's take a break from the theory of it all and get into QuickScore and actually take a look at how you set up goal and red flag. I'm going to need to log out and log back in as a different user than I was logged in earlier here in this session, so bear with me please just a minute. Oops, fat fingering during a demonstration, always happens. Okay, so I've logged back into QuickScore. What we're going to do is dive right into the scorecards area or section of QuickScore, and I'll find an existing organization that I created for the training purposes here today. It's an organization called January 2019 Scoring Webinar. Within that organization, we have a scorecard called January Scoring Webinar, populated with 2018 data. And within it, I've got a measure theme called All Scoring Type Measures, where I've created an example of each and every one of our 11 different scoring types, plus a couple of extras just for potential demonstration purposes. Our goal here today, right now, is to focus our attention on the goal, red flag, and the 3-color scoring types. So I'll click on goal, red flag. Of course, I see performance, mythical performance for the month of December 2018 and going back in history. Our focus here today is how was this goal and red flag measure set up? So I'll click the edit button towards the bottom of the black navigation pane to get into edit mode. Now, this session is not intended to wholesale teach you how to create measures. We have other training materials available about the creation of measures. So I'm not going to belabor every single property or setting here within that measure setup, but we will focus just on certainly the ones that pertain to scoring and coloring and others that just might be important. But we obviously have a name, It's set up as a measure. We did provide a description for this particular measure. Weight is something that does have impact on scores within QuickScore. But for now, I'm not going to get into the weight on this particular goal and red flag because we'll be addressing weighting a little bit later. But just to give you a quick preview, you'll see that what I have is, of course, all the myriad different scoring types, and they all roll up to the all scoring type measures theme over on the left, right? So goal and red flag is one component. It is equally weighted, just like all of the other measures under the all scoring type measures. We'll return to the discussion of weighting a little later. Moving down the screen here, the edit screen, we have measure details area. First selection here, very important, obviously, for setting up the scoring type, is the scoring type setting. And here again is your listing of all the 11 different scoring types available to you. I will tell you that the selection you make here in terms of the scoring type will immediately have impact on other fields available to you here in the measure, edit, or setup screen. So if I were to change goal and red flag to 4-color blue, take note that in the series area, there are more fields looking for my input than there were when I was just set at goal and red flag. So I'll go back to goal and red flag and show you that the series area is looking purely for an actual value, a red flag value, and a goal. If I were to change it to something like yes and no, notice that again, it has very much simplified the edit screen, the setup screen here, where it's looking for far fewer pieces of information from me about a yes-no measure. Okay, but I'll jump back to the goal and red flag and address further the setup of a goal and red flag. Again, in this case, we have set it up to be a measure that should be updated on a calendar basis of monthly. It is just a number type, data type. The aggregation type I'll return to in just a minute to have a brief discussion about that and its potential impact on scoring or not. Decimal precision is straightforward and so forth. So when you've set up a goal and red flag measure, in the series area, you have 3 fields that you can address. The first is actual value. This is where you're telling the QuickScore how and where the actual value month over month is going to come from. And your choices are manual or calculated or roll up. Okay. And again, today we don't really have the time to get into all the minutia of these different input types, but I'll tell you that manual is the most commonly employed, and it is the appropriate setting if you aspire or are using Connect to automatically import data into any particular measure in QuickScore. Moving over, red flag, of course, is, and I should also mention, please, folks, that the roll-up, this again is somewhat confusing to new users because they presume that if you're creating a measure that you aspire to be rolled up in a scorecard type hierarchy, that you should be selecting roll-up. Roll-up is very infrequently used. It's really only employed if you're creating a measure within a scorecard that is intended to serve as a template for the creation of other copies of that template. If it's very hierarchical in nature and is going to serve as a template, then and only then will you ever use the setting of roll-up. So manual is by far the most common setting for actual value as well, to be honest, for the other red flag and goal. Again, moving over to red flag, again, the same choices of how the data for red flag should be provided. In this case, we're leaving it at manual, and we're choosing to hard code a red flag value of 500. Similarly, for goal, we're leaving it at manual and hard coding a value of 800. Now, be aware that the setting of these hard coded red flag and goal values is optional. You don't necessarily have to do that. If I jump over to another example of goal and red flag without, in this case, thresholds, you'll notice as I scroll down that this is set up again as a goal and red flag measure, similar to what we just talked about with the other one, but I have not set any red flag or goal manual values. I'm not providing a default value. So the question is, well, what's the implication of those two different setups? If I remove myself from edit mode and take a look at the first goal and red flag measure and go to edit, you'll see that when I enter the edit opportunity to provide an actual value, that the red and goal values are already there. I don't have to input them for a given monthly time period. because they were hard-coded as a default value for that measure. And that is compared to the other goal and red flag value or measure where I didn't set default or hard-coded threshold values, and you'll see that those are empty and require month over month for me to define the red and the goals so that the actual value can actually be scored on a, 3-color goal and red flag paradigm. Okay? Going back to the goal and red flag and returning to edit mode, a couple other points I want to make here beyond, the obvious of just defining the red flag and goal values. With regard to using calculations, one thing that is fairly commonly employed amongst our customers is if they don't know a red flag value but do want to employ goal and red flag scoring, they will also often create a red flag threshold that is predicated on a goal value. So in this case, what you could do is set up the red flag as a calculated value and set it up as a measure that employs this very same measure and points to the goal and then takes a certain percentage of that goal. So for instance, let's say we want to take 75% of the goal to be our red flag. So that's a great example of where a calculated value can be employed to define a threshold value. I'll change this back to manual because we do just want to hard code it at 500. Another point here regarding thresholds is when users are assigned as updaters to a particular measure. So please focus your attention here down towards the bottom where we have a trial user who's been assigned as an updater. If you want to provide that updater the opportunity to adjust the hard-coded or default threshold values of 500 and 800 month over month because you acknowledge that thresholds should change, generally speaking, they should be 500 and 800, but in certain cases they should be other, you can click on the update thresholds and that will empower that updater to change the red flag and goal values month over month over month. Okay? Okay. That takes care of that. Let's take a look then at the 3-color scoring and just show you the difference between the goal and red flag that we just took a look at and now the 3-color scoring. Generally speaking, they're almost body doubles of each other, except for one key difference is if you set it up as a 3-color scoring type and look to the series area, note that in addition to red flag and goal, we also have a worst threshold that we can set and a best threshold we can set. So that again ties back to what I discussed when we were conceptually talking about the difference. This is your opportunity to set worst, user-defined worst and best threshold values. Okay? Okay, let's move away from our discussion of goal and red flag. I'll bring back up my PowerPoint presentation here and just move on to the next bucket, if you will, of scoring types. These are what I, again, call the binary different scoring types. So the first is goal only, and in this case, it's pretty straightforward. You define a goal. If that goal is met, it is scored as 10. If it's not met, it's scored as 0. The yes and no scoring, again, binary in nature. It's, you set it up to, the response is either going to be yes or no. If the response is yes, it gets a score of 10. If it's no, 0. No middle ground, no gray area here between the goal and goal only or the yes and no scoring. Please be aware with regard to yes and no scoring that yes doesn't always have to be 10. If you prefer in a certain situation where the response of yes is actually a bad thing, did we lose 50 customers this month and the answer of yes is bad, then of course you can set it up that yes is a bad thing, it gets 0, and no is a good thing and it gets the score of 10. And then lastly, setting up a goal, what we call two-color scoring. The difference here, again, in this case, is that you're not just defining a goal, but you're also defining, like we did in the 3-color scoring, a worst value and a best value to be assigned to the normalized 0 and the normalized 10. But be aware that the goal does not always have to sit directly in the middle. The goal will always be assigned a normalized score number of 5, but there may be situations where you want to push that goal further towards best, or you want to bring that goal further back towards worst. In either case, again, the goal that you define will be assigned to the normalized score of 5, but it's your choice what that actual value number should be. So we'll jump out of there and jump back into QuickScore quickly just to take a look some examples of goal only, yes, no, and two color. So I'll take a look at goal only first, and I'll edit. Again, the setup of goal only is quite similar in terms of the upper third, of course, name, type, weight, all of that. In the measure details area, of course, we're going to select goal only. And then a difference here is out towards the right of the scoring type and the calendar is our higher, better values. And your choices here are simply yes or no. And it's up to you to define whether achieving and exceeding the goal is a good thing or a bad thing. And then, of course, down along the bottom, or not towards the bottom, but in the series area, you have a single opportunity to define one single goal. No opportunity to define any kind of sense of worst or best. You're just defining a goal threshold that should, the system is looking to see whether it is exceeded or not. Moving over to yes and no. Again, quite similar to goal only. It's fairly simple in that once you select the yes and no scoring type, really what you're doing is just effectively defining whether yes is good. I alluded to the idea that yes could be good or yes could be bad. It's your choice as to whether yes is good or not. No need to define any sense of numeric thresholds for yes or no. And then moving to two color. In the two color paradigm, this is a little bit different. It's similar to goal, but in this case, you get the opportunity in the series area to define not only a goal, but a worst value and a best value. And besides that, it's quite similar to the goal only. Again, the result, of course, will be just red or green. But in this case, you'll get an appropriately scored or appropriately acknowledged normalized score somewhere on the overall spectrum between the worst of 0 and the best of 90. All right, I'll jump out of there, bring back up PowerPoint here real quickly, and cover a couple last scoring types that we'll address. The first is this idea of stabilized scoring. And today we only have the time to just address the two color stabilized scoring. And again, this is back to that warehouse inventory analogy that I brought up earlier, where you identify what your best number is. You can set low targets and high targets, and of course a low worst and a high worst. And then lastly, the idea of an unscored measure. An unscored measure, of course, doesn't require you to define any actual value thresholds. You don't have to define, no normalized scores will ever be applied to an unscored measure. And it's important for you to know that the scoring contribution weight in terms of as scores are rolled up to higher levels of an unscored measure is 0. So a frequent question is, well, why would you create an unscored measure? And this is often used to display targets or forecast data or simply to collect measure data that shouldn't be scored by itself, but can be a contributor to calculations for other scored measures. Okay? So again, just jumping back here into QuickScore to just take a look at two color stabilize and the setup. We'll jump into edit mode and scroll down. Again, as you might expect in the series area for a two color stabilized measure, you get, as we talked about, the opportunity to define a low worst value, a low target value, a best value, a high target value, and a high worst value. And then lastly here, with regard to unscored, about as simple a setup as you can get. It's, of course, you get the name, you select from the scoring type unscored at the top of the list. And again, there's no requirement, of course, to define any types of thresholds or anything. All you have to do is just specify how the actual value for that measure will be provided. Again, with the same choices of manual, calculated, or roll-up. Okay, so that's our relatively deep dive into the scoring types that we'll share with you today. And let's move ahead here. The last agenda item that we'll cover here today is discussion of score roll-ups, weighting, and some administrative settings that we think you should be aware of. Okay, so rolling up scores. Once measures have been scored, any superior scorecard objects such as objectives, perspectives, and even scorecards are similarly scored by rolling up a weighted average of all subordinate measure scores. And so it's the weighted average method of rolling up is the only thing that will apply to measure roll-ups. You can't change the aggregation type in terms of how measures are rolled up. But what you can do is adjust the weighting, which we'll discuss in a minute. So basic roll-up scoring is really quite straightforward. It's the weighted average of subordinate normalized scores that defines the score for any superior object. And in this case, we're using equal weighting for all, if you will, feeder subordinate measures. So on the left, we have an overall score for the superior. We'll call that an objective, right? Let's imagine that along the bottom are 4 different measures, 3 at 6.66, 1 at 10. So the 7.495 comes from just really quite simple math. 3 times the 6.66 to give you 19.98, plus the 1 times 10, add those together to get your 29.98, and divide that number equally by 4. Similarly, on the right, same idea, same paradigm at play here. 3 times the 6.67 plus 1 times the 3.34, added together, take the result of that, the sum of that, the 23.44, and again, divide it equally by 4 to get the 5.86. So this is a very, very simple example. As you can imagine, in large, robust scorecards, you're going to have, of course, many more measures than we're reflecting in that previous example. In this case, this is just a couple examples of if you have 100 different measures being fed up to one, let's say, objective. And in this case, it's really basically the same type of math, where if 99 of them are scored at 8.33, it'll do the multiplication there. It'll take the 1 times the 1.67, add those products together, and then divide equally by 100. Similarly, on the right, again, we have 100 different, feeder measures. In this case, fewer of them are at 8.33, but again, you multiply that by 74, multiply the 1.67 times the 26 measure feeders, add those numbers together, again, divide by 100 to come up with the normalized score for the yellow objective at 6.59. So both of those last 2 examples apply when you have equal weighting for all feeder measures. But there are situations where you may want to weight a single measure much more heavily than other measures that are feeding up, to an objective. So in this case, of course, we've got the exact same measure scores, but weighting different. So on the left with, equitable measure weights, we are again looking at the exact same paradigm. 2 times the red, 1.67, 3 times the green, 8.33. Take the results of that math, add them together, divide equally by 5 to get 5.66. But on the right, we have weighted, again, one single measure 9 times more than any of the other 4 measures. So in that case, it's again doing 10, in this case, 10 times the 1.67, then 3 times the 8.33, adding the product of those multiplications together, and in this case, dividing by 13 to get a much lower, normalized score for that objective, due purely to the weight of the one single measure that has been weighted 9 times more than the rest. Okay? Before we get into this, I'll show you an example of how to adjust weighting in a minute, but before we get there, the coloring of the superior roll-up objects, like objectives and perspectives and scorecard, is determined by a master setting for non-measure colors in the application administration area of QuickScore. The default for the setting is just basic 3-color, but be aware that there are other like 2-color and 4-color settings available for your non-measure scorecard objects. And that, again, is taken care of in the administration area under the configuration heading and the application administration controls. And in the scoring section of application administration, there is a setting for non-measure colors. We'll come back and take a look at some of these other administrative settings in just a minute. But before we get there, I want to just discuss the idea of roll-up a little bit further with you guys. So I'm going to change the organization that we're working with here and return to that customer support organization where you may recall earlier today when we were reviewing colors and scores in QuickScore, we came into customer satisfaction, following a track where we drilled down from an alert and got into customer satisfaction. So you'll see here that we have a theme of customer satisfaction, which breaks out to a couple different measures. One of the measures happens to be a calculated measure bringing 2 underlying measures, again, together. So in this case, customer satisfaction, if we look at it and say, well, how is this score, being created? And if you look over to the right, you'll see that it is, of course, bringing together the score for customer satisfaction and the score for customer churn, and it's bringing them together equally. So right now, the overall customer satisfaction score is 5.3. If I wanted to weight customer churn more heavily than customer satisfaction survey, because everybody knows nobody really fills out customer satisfaction surveys, so we really want customer churn to have more weight on our perception of our overall customer satisfaction, what I can simply do is go to customer churn, go to edit mode for customer churn, and change its weight from the 50%, which is achieved by a weight unit setting of 1. And let's say we want to make customer churn 3 times more impactful when that is when these scores are rolled up to the customer satisfaction theme level score. So you see that customer churn has now been assigned 75 weighting. Customer satisfaction survey is 25% weighting. And I'll save that and then go back up to, and I'll say done. I'm done making my editing changes. If I return to customer satisfaction, we see that the score now has been reduced down to 4.3 because the poor customer churn number of 3.33 has far more weight than it used to. So it reduced us down from a score of, I think it was like 5.4. I forget exactly what it was, down to a score now of 4.3. So that's weighting in a nutshell. And again, weighting applies all over the place throughout a scorecard. So if I were to go even to our mobile world corporate level scorecard, you can see that if we're looking at this high tier 1 mobile world balanced scorecard, you see that the 4 perspectives, financial, customer, internal processes, all have equal weighting. If I open up financial and click on it, you see that it is being fed by underlying, again, objectives. In this case, they chose to weight improved profitability more heavily than increase revenue and reduce sales costs and so on. And this idea of weighting as measures are actually rolled up is applied at all of the myriad levels of your scorecard hierarchy. Okay. Whoop, I need that back up again. And then we want to just briefly, before we open the phones up here for any kind of Q&A, just want to touch on some additional administrative settings that apply to scores. So what I've done here is I've entered into the administrative settings area of QuickScore. Under the configuration heading, I'm going to open up application administration, scroll down a bit on the right till I see the scoring area of the application administration settings. So there are 8 or so settings that are available to you here at an administrative level. The first and most obvious is, should scores be visible? And this pertains to, largely the speedometer gauges is the most common place where scores are presented. Right at the bottom in the middle, for a speedometer gauge, it will typically show you your score. And if you decide that you don't want those scores to be presented, but do still want to present the colors, you can opt out of showing scores by just setting this to no. Ignore gray scorecard items. The gray scorecard items are going to be things like unscored measures or measures that have not been provided any values at all. So if you want those just to be ignored as the measure scores are rolled up, you can set that to yes. If instead you'd prefer to have them included as a 0 value contributor, you can change it to no. By default here, the missing values, this sets when you're in a measure definition screen and you're defining a calculation. There's a default setting for what should be done if a value is missing. You can treat it as 0, treat it as NA, treat it as blank, or make the entire equation blank. What you set here just simply defines the default when you're viewing a measure in terms of its setup or edit mode. The show NA option, it gives you the opportunity when someone is updating a measure, whether they have an option to just say, I don't have any values for this month, so I want to make it non-applicable just this one month. It just provides an additional little button in the measure update screen that someone can just click on and effectively gray out the need to update a measure for a given time period. We already discussed the non-measure color. This is where at an administrative level, you dictate how non-measure objects are going to be colored within the scorecard. Enable forward effect scoring is hardly ever addressed. It pertains to when you set up a measure, let's say at a quarterly level, right? It's supposed to be its calendar is quarterly, so it only expects to be updated quarterly. And you find yourself, let's say, 2 weeks away from the end of the quarter, but you adjust your view of that measure down to the monthly level. The question is, should any values be presented for the months of that quarter that has not yet been finalized and provided any information? What you can do is carry forward the scores from the previous quarter if you want to do that, just so that there's something there as you look at it at a monthly level. Again, very, very seldomly employed. And then divide by 0 equals 0 is just a setting. You know, if by any chance a calculation ends up with a denominator of 0, if you don't set it to yes to make it a numerical or a score value of 0, then it will be considered a missing value and effectively just kind of null, and it will then fall back to what is dictated up here for missing values. Okay, just a quick review of our agenda. We reviewed colors and scores. I introduced you to normalized scoring and coloring. We saw all of, at least by name, all of the 11 different scoring types. We took a deeper dive review of some of the more commonly used scoring types, and we discussed score roll-ups and weighting and even some administrative settings. Before we jump here in a minute to open the phone lines up, I just want to invite you to please join us in February for our next free QuickScore webinar. And again, on the premise that some of you may not stick around to ask any questions, I do want to thank you for watching this webinar. I appreciate your time. I know it's valuable. Again, please feel free to contact me directly and personally. I'm Tom Keating, and I'm available at tom.keating@spiderstrategies.com, or you can also reach out to us via our education department email at learn@spiderstrategies.com. So with that, what we're going to do here on the webinar side of life is we're going to stop recording the webinar,